Thank you for joining us today. Our session on mental health, presented by Nadia. We'll get started. I appreciate all of you taking some time out of your day. For those that signed up and aren't able to make it today, this is being recorded, so it will go in the archive. My name is Jerry Fisk. I'm the Director of Athletics at Fredonia State University. Joining us today is Dr. Kevin Murphy. Kevin is a friend and someone that I've learned from for several years now. We crossed paths during our time at Elmira College. Kevin has taught for 10 years. He's been doing counseling for 23 years, and he's worked with athletics for a number of those years. While I've been at Fredonia, I've brought Kevin in to work with our student athletes and work with our coaches, and it's been very well received. I think part of that is Kevin is a former student athlete himself. He's worked as a counselor on campus. He's done telecounseling. He's been in private practice, and he's worked in a group home. Kevin understands the human condition, and I'm thankful to call him my friend. So Kevin, appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, Jerry. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for just echo Jerry's sentiment, thanking you for taking the time to be with us today. Couple of qualifying remarks just to kind of frame our discussion for the next hour or so. First and foremost, we have an hour to talk about topics that, frankly, we could spend literally months and months and months on. So understand that in as much as collectively we will endeavor to walk away with some really good concrete information by the end of the hour, much of what we're going to discuss is still scratching the surface. So I would encourage folks to continue to be self-directed. There's a lot of information out there. You don't have to limit yourself to what we hear today. So more on that later. Secondly, just to kind of frame what will be a lot of my responses and information I'm sharing, there's a couple of qualifying points as far as the human condition that Jerry referenced. So just to kind of have a backdrop here as we're talking about stress and mental health, particularly in the time of COVID for our athletes and for ourselves, a couple important points. One is the recognition that as an animal species, intelligence is arguably our primary survival skill. Okay, we're not the dominant force on the planet because of sharp claws and sharp teeth. It's because we're intelligent. Okay, and within that, there's a number of blind spots and sharp edges we need to be aware of, because much of that is having an impact, in my opinion, personally and professionally, on what we're all experiencing over the past many months of this ordeal. So if we're going to indicate intelligence as a survival skill, we should probably take a closer look at how does it actually serve or function to keep us alive. And it's very simple, very basic. Intelligence's primary function is twofold. First is to identify threat wherever and whenever it can, whether we've actually had something negative happen or not. And the more intelligent an individual is, the more readily able their brain is to identify threats. So this is where you get your classic worst case scenario thinkers, okay? If people have actually had negative experiences, hurtful, injurious experiences, then that dynamic is only exacerbated. The second function of intelligence, once a threat is identified, is to be able to identify a plan that says, how do I move forward in the face of this threat, this challenge, this stress? Be able to have a plan that's effective and efficient and will keep me as safe as possible, whether that's physical, psychological, social, or emotional. It all sounds so simple, but the compounding variable here is not only is intelligence a survival mechanism for us, we also have something that we experience as stress, anger, rage. Equally, it's the fight or flight response, okay? And that resides in a different region of the brain. So when we're talking about intelligence, right, cognitive functioning, that's ought to be seated in the neocortex up in the front. When we're talking about fight or flight, right, the human stress response, anytime you've been agitated, angry, afraid, stressed, anxious, tense, that's a different region of the brain. That's the limbic region of your brain, which is seated in the middle, right, about 2.5 inches down from my fingertips were just then. And the important distinction here is to recognize those two regions of the brain, the neocortex and the limbic region, work in opposition of one another like a teeter-totter. So if you were ever a kid growing up and you played a teeter-totter, you understand the mechanics of that. That's very much how our brain functions. So if you have an individual who recognizes or is experiencing a stress or a threat, whether that threat is their own thought processes, because their own thoughts trigger this, or an actual event, unless we have very specific skills and knowledge on board, as soon as our brain identifies the threat, it goes into fight or flight, right? So essentially, fight or flight comes on. So if intelligence is this end of the teeter-totter and the stress response is this end, the higher fight or flight goes, literally we get stupider. And that's actually supposed to be a survival mechanism, because in life or death situations, we don't need to be thinking clearly, we just need to be a force of nature. And that's what fight or flight allows for. And the cognitive capacity is being diminished. You've all experienced this, whether you've had threats in your life or not, because every single person on this call, I'm sure, at one point or not in your life, you've got an argument with people. And you've probably had a dynamic where you're in an argument with a person, you're very upset, you're passionate about the topic, the argument ends, and 10 or 15 minutes later, as you start to calm down, you start to think of all these great comebacks and all these great points that you should have made during the argument. It's very common, it's very frustrating, but what literally is going on neurologically is during the argument, you're in fight or flight to some degree, your cognitive capacity is compromised, and as you calm down after the fact, neurological reascendancy, cognitive reascendancy occurs, and all of a sudden you have all these witty comebacks and great points. Silly and cursory example though that is, that's a perfect capture for what's going on a large scale with many people, particularly in the world we are now living, because we are bombarded by threats in the form of COVID, the political situations being what they are, the civil unrest, implications this all has on our day-to-day routine and functioning, and the fact that it has taken us all off the map. And one of the worst things you can do for an intelligent animal, such as human beings, is to put them in a position where they're off the map and their world is inundated with question marks. Because now we're overwhelmed with emotion, we can't think clearly, and we're stuck in the corner. And I think collectively that's been the metaphor for the past 6, 7, 8 months for many of us individually, and certainly our families and our systems as a whole. So that's really what we're here to talk about today, is how can we start moving forward in the face of all that. But sharing that baseline fundamental dynamic is really essential to understanding the how of moving forward. So.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that. Yeah, that teeter-totter is pretty powerful, and we encounter it daily, whether we know it or not.
Yep.
So as we get into this, obviously one of the big focuses for everyone on the call is supporting our student athletes. Right now things are tough. Practices are different if you're at a school where you're able to have practice. There are no contests right now. We've always gotten together with our student athletes as coaches and administrators to try and hear from them and support them and meet them where they are. And we can't do the same things the same way that we've always done them. Now we're on Zoom and we're trying to send out emails and things like that. And we can't have that, what we've always perceived as a deep, meaningful conversation that's face-to-face. How do you suggest we try to address some of these things? And you know, is Zoom effective? How do we use Zoom and leverage Zoom for productive manner?
Yeah. So, you know, I have a very personal perspective on that. As you referenced in my introduction, I've been doing telemedicine since spring of 2020 with a practice out in Seattle, in addition to my other professional pursuits. And I can tell you, and I know firsthand, as we all do, that there's something substantive that's difficult to articulate that gets lost via video versus being face-to-face. So I think first and foremost is for ourselves and for our student athletes, acknowledging the normalcy of that, right? That this isn't specific or unique to you or your institution or your team. This is difficult for all of us, right? Because we want to take away those question marks, we want to take away the uncertainty. The importance of that is simply this: in the absence of a rational, reasonable explanation or acknowledgement of the normalcy of a dynamic, the human brain still requires answers. And this is where people, particularly younger people, if they've had negative experiences growing up, their brain is very good at making them the issue, right? Because if we can create some kind of perspective that says, what are we doing to contribute to the issue, then we can create our own solutions, right? Because all they have to do is work harder or be smarter or be more diligent, and things will improve. And people have done that. I've had numerous conversations beyond counting over the past 6 months with people who have tried different initiatives under their own power to try to make this all better and make Zoom better or make the modifications to work more tolerable, and it doesn't work, and then they put it on themselves, right? They vilify themselves, they beat themselves up because it's just not working, and now it becomes evidence of how deficient they are, and now that becomes an even larger threat because now we're ensconced in a world full of shades of gray and challenges. You now have people starting to develop a perspective that says, I can't deal effectively with this, and that becomes the biggest threat of all. So you have people who are literally walking around chronically elevated and escalated, which only compromises their ability to meet the challenges. So first and foremost is normalizing it, right? I think personal disclosure, self-disclosure goes a long way. I think when student athletes hear from their coaches and their administrators and their faculty that this is hard for us as well, right? That can go a long way to kind of leveling the playing field. That being said, once you acknowledge that, you want to, as best as able in a collaborative fashion, to work with your teams, with your colleagues on how do we maximize our communication, right? So this is where doing more concrete things as far as handouts, following up conversations with, you know, documentation about what we talked about, being more precise in our planning. Oftentimes, in my experience doing organizational consultation, irrespective of the location and type of industry, people oftentimes, when they work together to do planning, they're very good at talking about all the things that need to be happening, but oftentimes they neglect to create concrete structures or timelines or who's going to do what when. So putting more emphasis on that for the athletes. But even before all of that, right, those concrete strategies and skills, right, all of it is built off of more effective communication. And effective communication is secondary to making sure that emotionally people are in a place where they're stable enough to think clearly and be cogent. And this goes back to the whole teeter-totter concept. So in terms of supporting ourselves, our athletes, our systems, we would do well to break the strategies down into 3 different dimensions: physical, emotional, and cognitive. And they're sequenced very deliberately that way. Physical, because all of this, all of our stress response, our thoughts, our cognition are all seated in the biological system, which is our body. So we have to understand the whole teeter-totter process. The stress response is predicated by the release of up to 48 different chemicals that once our brain identifies a threat, real or imagined, it releases this cocktail of chemicals to turn us into a force of nature to facilitate fight or flight. We've already talked about the cognitive impairing properties of that. One of the really critical issues to recognize is essentially every chemical in the human body has a process where once that chemical has served its function, it gets reabsorbed. It has a reuptake process. The 48 stress chemicals do not get reabsorbed spontaneously. They have to be burned off through physical activity. So one of the best recommendations we can have, and this is where our athletes, it resonates with more than the general population, because athletes all have had the experience subjectively that they're stressed, they're angry, they're upset, they go and they practice, they go do a workout, and they feel better afterward. They might not understand why they feel better. They just know working out helps them burn off stress and feels better. But literally what's going on biochemically is they're burning off those 48 stress chemicals that will not go away otherwise. So making sure student athletes and our systems as a whole and us ourselves, if we're not already doing it, put in a primary emphasis, put in a premium on working out, right? And not only proactively as far as regularly scheduled workouts, but having physical tools as a reactive measure. So I myself, I will be very clear with people when I do clinical work, when it's face-to-face, that there will likely be occasions where you'll show up for a session and I'll be like, hey, give me a minute, right? And 90% of the time I'll be returning an email or a call that can't wait, but the other 10% I'll be out of sight of the door doing a set of push-ups to failure because my morning's starting to get stressed, so I need to take some kind of positive action to burn those chemicals off, because what most people do when their stress level starts to rise is they either just internalize it and bottle it up, which is a great short-term strategy, but it's like putting air in a balloon. If you keep inflating the balloon, eventually it's going to pop, or they try to talk themselves through it in terms of their internal processing. If you have someone who is having mounting stress occur and they try to be cognitive, that's when your brain is more likely to go worst case scenario thinking, right? Because the emotion is going to amplify that dynamic we already have of finding all the threats. So first and foremost, we want to make sure people are proactively working out to keep the baseline of those chemicals low. And secondly, that they're doing things in response to mounting stress. And the way to keep an eye on that is to have your athletes create a spectrum within themselves, 0 to 10. 0 is they're perfectly relaxed, their teeter-totter is situated like this, they're thinking clearly, and their head's about to explode off their shoulders, they're so overwhelmed with emotion. So encourage them to periodically check in through the course of their days, where am I 0 to 10, and to identify a threshold within themselves that says if I'm at or above this number, I need to step back and do something physical or talk to somebody I trust or go listen to music or do something that I know takes the edge off of my emotions. For me personally, that threshold is a 3. So if I'm at a 3 or above, I'm pausing, I'm taking myself out of the routine, doing something physical, going for a walk, doing the push-ups, whatever, because it's not going to remedy on its own. It's not going to spontaneously resolve itself. So before any strategies, right, that's the fundamental basic strategy, is to really incorporate those kind of elements. Obviously, sleep, nutrition, hydration, all of those are critical as well, but there is no substitute for the physical release of the stress. And secondary to that, that's then when people are more in tune, right? They're better able to facilitate strategies in terms of better communication. Just their communication, their ability to be cogent in their thinking is amplified by extension of those practices.
So as we take that and we move into Zoom and talk about how to do things through Zoom, are there ways that you would encourage or discourage us to utilize that aside from having those specific plans?
Yeah. So I think where you integrate, that theory to practice is, so myself, for instance, right? So over the past 3 weeks, Elmira College has been on, virtual only. The private practice I work at is virtual only. The owner got tested positive with COVID. So for me, knowing, one, that doing video work is a lot more challenging, right? I can sit in a room with people and talk all day and feel not one iota of stress. I genuinely can tell you that. The video thing is a completely different animal, right? In one part, it's new, and new generally is a stress facilitating process for human beings anyway. So in my case, using myself as an example, I will, after minimally 4 sessions, I have a half-hour break built in where I will go and do something physical. I'll get outside and get some sunshine and some fresh air. I will change the landscape, and then now better refreshed, come back in and do another block of 4 sessions and then have that break. I have not, in 24 years of professional practice, I have never built breaks in for myself when I was doing clinical work. I would literally see 14, 15, 16 people straight, 45-minute sessions with no breaks in between and be perfectly okay doing that. I'm finding the necessity in the video world with Zoom sessions that I have to build in some breaks because it's a different level of stress. So using that as an exemplar, you know, if our students, and they're having to do classes virtually, they're having to do meetings and team meetings and all of that on Zoom, they're likely going to experience similar dynamics. So they have to be more mindful of taking better care of themselves, building in more rest gaps. I think, you know, I said 3 categories: physical, emotional, and cognitive. The emotional piece is, if it's a generally good practice to make sure you're having fun and that you have things to look forward to, as cursory as that sounds, it's probably even more important in the world of COVID. Right? Because beyond having something to look forward to, which helps us kind of regulate our emotions in a more positive disposition, doing something enjoyable locks us into the moment. And if you have individuals who are under chronic stress and they're intelligent, that goes back to that worst case scenario thinking configuration. So now these are people who are going to be thinking 10 miles down the road, worrying about all the awful things that could happen. And even though most of those things never happen, even though they're not happening in real time, the person still has to pay the emotional price for what they're thinking, right? Your body still experiences the stress and all the negative implications of that. So when we do things that are enjoyable, that locks us in the moment and helps us ground our thinking in the now, and we're doing something that's enjoyable. So obviously there's a benefit there. And college students and we as professionals, obviously our schedules are very tight, they're very demanding, but under optimal circumstances, it's still important to have regular scheduled activities to look forward to and enjoy. I would contend that it's even more important now, right? We have to do a better job and be more concrete and intentional in taking care of ourselves because we're living in a world that is less able to do so. One of the things I think that's important also, and this is really more of a reframe, we don't have control over the larger dynamics that are causing all of this, right? And that's a very disheartening thing. It creates a sense of despondency and hopelessness, especially for, you know, people who are on the younger end of the scale, our student athletes, college-age student athletes. So exerting power and control where you can actually is a huge tethering point, right? So the more we can talk to them about these concrete strategies, things they have control over, anchoring their perceptions in the moment, that creates a sense of empowerment that probably is lacking very significantly for the bulk of the student athletes we're working with. And ourselves, frankly.
Yeah. One of those groups that sometimes we leverage to help in situations are captains, or our SAC group. Yep. Talk about maybe some of the things that are important to consider before you pull in captains to help with a situation, or we utilize SAC as a campus. Are there certain things that need to be in place before we talk to those groups? Because those are student athletes as well. And I think sometimes we look past that and we say, that's a leader, that's someone that I can rely upon, that's someone that's sort of on the leadership team. But I feel like right now, with everything going on in the COVID world, we have to be careful about that.
So yeah, agreed. So I would suggest as a starting point that before we start bringing in any student level leadership, that we as leaders and professionals ourselves are crystal clear on what exactly is the messaging, what product do we want them to bring to the teams, right? We want to make sure that it's as prescriptive as possible, and that might be a variation of historic practice, because in my experience, oftentimes, you know, you rely on your student leaders, your captains, to kind of take the initiative and set the frameworks with the team. We as you know, coaches or professionals might set the broad parameters, but then we leave it to our captains to kind of carry the ball down the field for us, so to speak. But I don't know that we can do that in this circumstance because it's so off the map and they're so less equipped than us, at least on paper, by virtue of their age and lack of maturation compared to us. So I think we really need to be much more prescriptive. And to do that, we have to be very clear on what is our end point. What is it we're looking to create, and be very, very, very concrete in that. And from there, reverse engineer the tools and the skills and the strategies necessary, and then communicate that to the captains. And then again, modifying practice where in the past we might not have had, you know, it might have been a set frequency. Maybe you meet with your captains once a week or once every couple of weeks to do a check-in. That frequency needs to be increased. Okay, I don't know that we can rely on them in the ways that we historically could, because they're experiencing a level of stress and turmoil that extends itself far beyond their maturation level to deal with. And I'm going to be a bit long-winded here, more than I already am, but please indulge me on this. So I think one of the biggest challenges I've been observing with the college age population through all this, particularly in the past month and a half that we've been back on campus, is if you consider from childhood through adulthood, the maturational process is supposed to happen in a very paced and measured way, by which I mean this, that as you increase your capacity to be intellectually aware and knowledgeable of the world around you, your emotional ability is supposed to rise at a commensurate level. So as I become more intelligent and able to recognize the dynamics in the world around me, my ability to handle the emotions that come from that awareness are supposed to rise to a proportional level, okay? So now, if you look at a set of circumstances where we have an entire generation of college age students and younger who, by virtue of the world around them, and part of this is social media, that's a whole other conversation in terms of how exposed they are, but just the raw volume of what's going on over the past 6, 7, 8 months, not only with COVID, but the administration and the politics and all that stuff that's going on and the civil unrest, that they are now being put into a forced evolution position is kind of how I'm framing it, that they're more aware of how dysfunctional and broken the world can be. They're now more aware of how inept systems can be in their handling of things. But just because they're more knowledgeable about that, their awareness is higher, doesn't mean that their emotions have elevated to meet that challenge. In fact, what I've been seeing a lot of, not only individually, but in systems, is the emotional capacity to deal with these increased threats and awareness is actually compromised because now these systems or the individuals, the athletes in particular, are overburdened with more emotion than they know what to do with. So we have to be mindful and aware of that, it's the equivalent of, let's put it in athletic terms, you have an athlete that can squat 600 pounds comfortably, and now you put them into the gym, it's like, hey, here's 1,000, get it done. And if we still have the same expectations for outcomes, we're only adding burden to an already burdensome system. So we have to be a little bit more emotionally aware and intelligent of where they are, right? Not based on their chronological age, because very few people chronologically and emotionally during circumstances like this are going to be at the same level, right? So we want to be sensitive and recognize the vulnerabilities that they're experiencing and help them in turn recognize it themselves. So again, it becomes normalized. They don't think they're in this by themselves. They don't think they're broken. And in the wake of that, okay, all of these things being said, there's certain things we can't control, but let's put our time and focus and emphasis into the things we can control. Our own well-being. What do we do with the stress? What kind of routines and patterns do we need to modify? Because again, in an athletic metaphor, if you had student athletes who they blew out their knee, their ACL is just trashed, right? You're not going to expect them to run or jump or perform at the same level. And as they're rehabbing, they're going to have to take extra measures to take care of themselves to deal with that injury if they expect to rehab in an effective way and come back stronger than before. Same concept, just a different kind of system. We're talking about neurologically, emotionally, cognitively, events that are significantly injurious to those biological systems. So we have to basically modify our approach accordingly, no differently than we would with a physical injury.
So you talked about some of the tactics and strategies to maybe do that. Check in with them, make sure that they understand they're not broken, that it's a function of what's going on in the world and around them, sort of control the controllables. Are there other tactics that you would encourage us to be mindful of in dealing with that?
So, given that we are a social animal, right, and the need under, again, optimal circumstances to have those social relationships, connections, have people that you can be vulnerable with, open up and use others as resources. If those are best practices during good times, they become even more essential now, right? So this is where I made the brief reference a moment ago to the social media element, right? So we have to be mindful that even without all of this, we have populations of student athletes that we're working with that we all, right, as adults probably had more social contact face-to-face by the time we were 7 or 8 years old than many of our student athletes had by the time they walked into our institutions as freshmen, right? So there is a deficiency, I think, with many of the students in this generation and their capacity to connect up face-to-face and use other people as resources. I've been to a lot of colleges, I've worked with a lot of college-age students where it becomes evident that they can barely have a conversation with a faculty who says, hey, see me after class, right? So this is not the time that we want to endorse or encourage or espouse isolation. These are the times that we need students to connect more with the resources than ever before. And it starts with us. We have to show them the way because many of them, this too is off the map. So increasing our contact, increasing our positive contact, being more strength-based, right? The human condition cries out to commiserate and to overly focus on the stress and the threats. And we can do that, but if we don't spend at least a comparable amount of time focusing on what to do about it and how we're going to use each other as mutual supports, then everything is lost. And I frame it as the 55-5 dynamic, right? Typically, when you put a group of human beings together to address an issue, if they have a 60-minute meeting, most groups will spend 55 minutes talking about the nature of the issue and complaining about it and stressing over it, and then 5 minutes talking about what to actually do about it. And that's why oftentimes organizations stay stuck, right? Because they're not putting the time and the resources and energy into the solution focus end of the dialogue. And then to compound it, you oftentimes get the meeting after the meeting where people are gathering together after the meeting and doing more complaining and lamenting and vilifying people in the leadership positions without ever actually addressing the underlying issues and coming up with some solutions. So we want to make sure that our athletes are avoiding those dynamics, that again, they're aware of them, they're normalized, but it's an opportunity because this is the reality. We can't control the bigger things, but we can control what we take out of this. And I've always had the disposition, if you have to go through an awful set of circumstances, then at least take something of value out of it. And again, what I found over the years is that dynamic or that thought tends to resonate with student athletes more than the general population, because by nature of what they do, they're used to suffering for a beneficial outcome. They're used to enduring pain to create success. So it's the same dynamic, just at a psychological, emotional, cognitive level that says, okay, if I'm going to have to go through this, and I'm going to have this acceleration of awareness and all the pain and the turmoil and challenge, how do I translate this into something that's positive and valuable for me for decades to come? And that's the reality. That's really what the inherent opportunity and gift of all of this is. We can't control the larger circumstances, but we can control taking something of value out of this.
Perfect. I think that's a great point. Pain with a purpose, for sure.
Yep.
So there are a couple other groups that I think we need to be mindful of, and we need to make sure we're working to support as well. And one of them is our staff. It's a tough time to lead right now. The ways that we've done things, face-to-face meetings and office drop-bys just to check in on people and things like that, they're not working the same way that they used to. We're discouraged from some of those things. You've talked about how we do this with student athletes, so I would sort of expect that there are a lot of parallels, but talk to me about supporting our staffs.
So your turn of phrase there, parallel, is exactly the segue. I mean, you set me up with a home run ball, because there's a dynamic in organizational psychology called parallel process, right? Which is basically the concept that what applies to an individual is also applied systemically, right? So systems are living, breathing things comprised of human beings. So if you look at and study how an individual human being responds to stress biologically, emotionally, cognitively, socially, the impairments that an individual suffers apply to a system as well. And if you need any evidence of that, look at this country since post 9/11, right? If you look at the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress and you overlay that to our culture over the past 18, 19 years, almost, you can go through and check it off like a grocery list. It's almost 100% match, okay? So our system has been, as a nation at a macro level, our system has been a case study in post-traumatic stress. Well, guess what? We're now seeing this in more acute ways in the wake of COVID as well, right? So all the things that we've referenced thus far that can be of value to individuals in terms of student athletes and to teams, it applies to our staff as well, because it's all the same mechanism, right? We're all the same animal, a quarter inch underneath the skin, right? Gender differences notwithstanding, our nervous system typically all functions in a very similar way. So again, in support of staff, we want to be mindful of erasing question marks as much as we can, identifying where we have direct control, the things we can influence, having mechanisms built into our day-to-day and week-to-week routines where people can access and utilize support as needed, and then we have formal check-ins where the expectation is, okay, in the past, it might have been okay to bottle your stuff up or whatever, or, have your meeting after the meeting, but we need to abandon those practices moving forward, at least for the duration of this crisis, because we know that's not going to work for us. How do we know? Let's just look at the outcomes we're experiencing, right? So at the very least, let's make a commitment to supporting each other, being more strength-based, building in practices where we're regularly burning off the stress, whether that's through, structured activity, right? In terms of like, hey, at least 3 half-hour blocks a week during your workday. The expectations you're getting out and doing something to take care of yourself, or you're building those stopgap measures similar to what I described with a half-hour break every 4 sessions for me. That we're doing this, right? And that as leaders, that we are holding our staff accountable to those practices, because if we can instill those practices at a level that this is as much your job expectations as anything else that you do, and then hold them to account on that and support them, this is all to their good, because the ultimate outcome we're all trying to collectively create and facilitate is to be the best mechanisms we can to support and facilitate the growth of our student athletes, and we have to be in the best position of strength to do that. So it starts with us taking care of ourselves individually and us making sure that our teams are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Staff teams, I mean.
Yeah. Well, that's the staff. You sort of touched on it a little bit. I don't know too many people that sit in the AD chair that I know well that I think are great at self-care. We try to give, we try to make sure we're supporting, because truthfully, I think a lot of us identify ourselves and sort of hold a lot of our value from our role, from our professional position. That's hard right now, and that's, I think, I'll speak personally, it's easier for me to identify what you're saying about how to help my student athletes and how to help my staff. How do we sitting in the big chair do some of these things? I'm sure it's as easy as the same thing, but it doesn't feel the same.
Well, so here's the thing, you know, perspective and belief matters, right? So first and foremost, if you're going to institute any kind of modification or addition, even if it's a positive to a system, including ourselves, we have to make sure that philosophically we have a point of view that allows for that. So I'm going to use my example because it's myself as an example because it's easy to do. So I made reference to two key points that feed your question, Jerry. One, that in the face-to-face therapy world, seeing people, I will go literally 12, 14, 15 hours without a break, other than the 30 seconds to run and go to the bathroom, right? Or, you know, refill my water bottle or whatever. And that's a relic from when I worked in group homes where literally you had 16-hour shifts where you were going nonstop, right? And now in the video world, as I referenced, I'm finding myself having to take, you know, every 4 sessions a half-hour break, which doesn't feel good to me, right? Because that feels like a defeat, because many people who are driven and high achievers, which I would contend are pillar capacities that lend people to be ADs in the first place, right? Anything that reeks of, hey, this isn't my typical routine, this is a compromise, or it's going to feel like a diminishment, okay? But it's about creating a perspective that finds value. So one, logically, I understand that's necessary because things have changed, right? So what I use is the metaphor, if I'm out running, I'm running on flat ground, I could, you know, run and run and run forever at a comfortable pace, you know, more or less. But now if I'm running up a steep hill, all of a sudden things have changed, right? So I can still try to maintain the same pace and put out my 1 gear effort, but I need to recognize I'm not going to be going as fast. It's going to hurt more. It's going to be more strenuous because the rigor has increased. So it doesn't mean I have to be happy with that pain, but I can recognize the purpose. If I stay the course and make these modifications in the short term, eventually I'm going to be able to perform at a comparable level as I was on flat ground. I just have to steel myself to the facts and take a little bit more time. So as we sit here now, and I'm talking about every 4 sessions taking a half-hour break, when I started doing the video stuff back in March when the college got sent home, I was taking a break every 2 sessions, right? So, but that was months ago. So now I'm expanding out, and the ultimate goal, my own metric, is to get to the point where I can go nonstop all day in the video session world, no differently than I did with the face-to-face, all with an eye towards recognizing that, again, I can't change those larger circumstances, but I can find a way to make it work for me. So now this becomes a new challenge for me to expand my skills and capacities. And 2, I know that once I'm back in the face-to-face world, that's gonna be that much more streamlined, that much more effective. I'm gonna enjoy it that much more and be that much more better of a provider, right? So this all has value, but if you don't conceptualize it like that, what we're left with is a brain that's only gonna focus on the negatives and how much this sucks and the diminishment that creates for us as professionals. And I don't know that that's a good foundation to build any kind of growth and change on, particularly in the face of chaos and crisis at the level we're having to collectively deal with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Implementing it, I think, is the next step, and that's probably tougher than conceptualizing it, but those are steps that would be beneficial. Are there things that you would encourage us to help implement those things?
Yes. So I am all about, at the end of the day, I'm a very simple-minded human being, right? So in the face of complexity, I think it's best to simplify as best able, obviously. So, and I'm certainly, you know, I feel free. I'll give my email out at the end of all this. If people want a copy of this document, I'd be happy to send it to you. But I have a framework I've been using for quite some time in therapy that basically breaks down the different dimensions of our life, right? In terms of like self-care, in terms of professional performance, in terms of communication, in terms of relationship building, things like that, finances, all the critical domains that contribute to us as hopefully functional, healthy, successful adults, okay? And then with each of those areas, right, just capture a very specific stated goal or intent, right? So I think in 6-month blocks of time, so over the next 6 months, say in the area of self-care, this is my intent. This is what I aspire to create. This is what I'm committing myself to. And then within that, there's 3 very, very basic columns. The first column is, given what I intend to create for myself, these are things I know I need to do all of the time. These are non-negotiable. There's no thought or debate. These are things that without fail I do. The third column is these are the things I never do because I know they're going to take away or impair or inhibit my ability to create what I intend to create. So boom, create those, what those are, guardrails. I always do it and I never do it. And then within that, that second column, that middle column is given this particular area, what do I anticipate are the points of friction or tripping points that might occur as I move down the pathway. And again, 6 months is what I use arbitrarily. It could be any time frame, right? But as I move down this pathway towards effectuation of that intended outcome, what are the things that can trip me up? And what am I going to do to either avoid those things occurring, or if they do occur, get through them as efficiently and effectively? Because A, this goes back to the need for the human brain to have a plan established in the face of crisis or threat. And I'm of the opinion that the time to figure out that plan is not when that threat is upon you, okay? It's to figure it out well in advance, being proactive, right? And two, if you do even a halfway moderately decent job at formulating column 1 and column 2, your plan is already created, right? Because you know, always do this, never do this. And it's very basic and it's very simple. I can tell you from personal professional experience, it's very effective. And everybody on this call who's achieved any kind of success in your life, which you obviously have, or you wouldn't be on this call in the first place, you've been doing similar mechanism, maybe not with the same degree of intentionality, maybe not with the same degree of focus, but you've been doing it your entire life. The only difference here is doing it with a greater degree of deliberation and planfulness versus just doing it in oftentimes as a reactive posture. So very concrete tool, very effective, and it's a living, breathing document. So it's not a lifetime contract. You modify and add and delete as you move forward, and that's the beauty too, because now you have a concrete set of metrics that allow you to very knowingly figure out what works and what doesn't. And if we're looking to support our student athletes, be able to introduce similar mechanisms for them and for the teams. And now we're all working off the same blueprint, for which makes for much more cogent and collective and streamlined performance, irrespective of the endeavor.
Great. Before we get to any questions, what else do you want us to know? What else is going to help us, support our student athletes, marshal support for them, work across campus, and set them up for success?
Okay, so you've known me for 5 years, right? We worked together at EC, and as you noted, you've had me come out and you've heard me speak innumerable times over the years. In any of those instances, or anytime you ever talked to me when I was in professional capacity, even now, do I seem the least bit like I'm not having fun? Do I seem stressed? Do I seem agitated? Or it's like, and I said this to Julie before the conversation started, before everyone came on, she thanked me for, I'm like, I love the sound of my own voice. So anytime I get the chance to speak at people for an hour, I'm going to take that with a big smile on my face, right? I referenced a few minutes ago how critically important perspective and beliefs are, right? The model of psychology I subscribe to weighs heavily on the fact that our emotions, our behaviors, and what we focus on and gravitate towards the world is all predicated off what we believe to be true, right? And the good news in that is we have complete and utter control over what we believe. So knowing that, I choose to cultivate an attitude of appreciation and joy in everything that I'm doing. I like what I'm doing, even the things that are stressful and are difficult, and I could go on and on about the different things I work professionally, still find ways to create value in some sort of enjoyment, right? Because that's where we have our most deliberate control. So if you have to go through, again, that pain with purpose concept, if you have to go through a challenging, hurtful, injurious, potentially circumstance, then trying to find the way to make the best out of it that you can. Not in an irreverent way, not in a self-deluded way, but just a matter of fact, practical, because the bigger picture is this. One, when I consider the different challenges I've faced in my life, as awful as COVID is at a national or global level and how many people are suffering, I myself have not been directly impacted by it, right? I don't have it. People I love and care about haven't gotten it. So to be able to keep that perspective, because otherwise you get overwhelmed. The collective, vicarious nature of that. So keeping that perspective, then within that saying, okay, given this opportunity, right, to develop additional skills. And to me, the one singularly positive thing about this whole experience is it creates a leveling agent for everybody, right? So a year from now, hopefully when this is all calmed down and we're hopefully back to a normal routine, when I have people come in and they're stressed about their job, or I have a college student sitting across from me bitching about their roommate, right? It's like, well, yeah, I understand that's frustrating, but how's it compared to last year? How's it compare to having to do everything virtual, right? And I guarantee you, I feel very confident saying this, that people are like, oh, you know what, you're right? Because if we don't have concrete things to tether ourselves to, our brain's job is to make whatever circumstance we're dealing with feel like the worst thing ever. So having experiences to do a comparative analysis, be like, okay, this is tough, but compared to other things I've gone through, this is nothing by comparison. That's the value ultimately of an experience like this, and we're all having it. right? We're having subjective differences in how we deal with it, but it's something that we're all experiencing. If you talk about the human condition concept, this is all something that's contributing to our collective human condition. So there is a great deal of value and resilience and strength that can come from this if we have the mindset to facilitate that. And again, the good news is we control what we think, we control how we choose to look at things. So that's my best and most fervent suggestion is to do what you can to cultivate an attitude of appreciation and strength-based perspective. And that's a whole lot easier to do if you're taking care of yourself physically, if you're keeping your stress at tolerable levels, because now you're going to be more open to be creative and think laterally and to be able to identify those different tethering points. And try to have fun, right? I mean, in a world that's going insane, try to have as much fun as you can, as simple as that sounds.
Yeah, Kevin, one of the other things that I have heard you present on before that I'd like you to spend a few minutes on is we've gotten together and we've asked student athletes, you know, when everything's going sideways, what % of their worst case scenario thinking do they think comes true? And I know you've chased that down before. Do you mind chasing that down for the group? Because I think that's powerful.
Yeah, so it's predicated off of two really key points, right? One is that unless we create strategies to intervene, the human nervous system will respond to thoughts just like it does actual events, okay? Our brain doesn't on its own differentiate between thought and reality. And the best example of this is if you ever believed in Santa Claus when you were a kid, you probably likely had trouble falling asleep on Christmas Eve. Why? Because you're jacked up and excited, but that excitement didn't happen spontaneously. It happened secondary to what you were thinking. You believed in Santa Claus, you're thinking about Christmas morning, presents, the whole 9 yards, right? So similarly, it works that way with negative things too. So if someone's thinking, if their brain's doing its job and identify all these threatening things that could happen, they're going to feel the emotion of that unless they have certain tools and skills and knowledge on board. So that's an important point. The other point is cognitive psychology, of which I'm a big fan. There's a school of thought within that that makes the suggestion that the average human being can think upwards to 300 to 1,000 thoughts per minute, which is a staggeringly high array of thinking. And where people fall on that scale is built off of two variables primarily, how intelligent they are and how stressed they are, because the more intelligent somebody is, the more deeply and frequently they're thinking, and stress obviously accelerates right into turbo mode thinking. So if you take those two facts, I will then ask people, okay, think back to last year, calendar year 2019, what percentage of your worst case scenario thinking actually happened? And I'll typically get, you know, oh, let's, 10, 15%. I'm like, okay, so let's just for easier math say 10%, okay? But that doesn't really mean a whole lot yet because there's no real quantitative context. But the point I'll make at that junction in the conversation is, so consider that even though only 10% of your worst case scenario thinking happened, you still paid the physical and emotional and cognitively impairing price for the other 90% of things that didn't happen. So are you in the habit of paying for things you don't actually get the product of? Think on that. The second point then, though, I will launch into the whole, 300 to 1,000. And most people, when you frame it that way, will acknowledge, yes, they're worst case scenario thinkers, and they really are at that 1,000 per thought minute end of the scale. So I'll say, let's make an assumption that you sleep 12 hours a day, which is a ridiculous assumption, right? Especially for college kids. But let's say, just for easy math, I'm not a big math whiz, let's say that you sleep 12 hours a day. So last year, 2019, every day you're awake for 12 hours, you thought 1,000 thoughts per minute. That's 60,000 thoughts an hour. That's 720,000 thoughts per day, right? 365 days a year, that's 262,800,000 thoughts that you thought last year, and you're telling me that 10% of those worst case scenario thoughts happened. So you're sitting here and telling me that 26.8 million bad things happened to you last year. And then I'll pause, right? And they kind of get a sheepish smile on their face. Typically, it's like, are you being a bit dramatic? Because that seems like a way, right? Have 26.8 million things happen, period, right? I'm very clear to qualify. I'm not trying to minimize the awful things that actually happen, but just to illustrate, even when we lowball that estimate, and 10% is a fairly lowball estimate, we're still overwhelmingly catastrophizing the events in our life. And if you live in a world where you literally are telling your brain and your nervous system that all these horrible things are happening, how would you expect people to feel? Under optimal circumstances, let alone with everything else that's going on, right? So everything we're talking about today, that's really what it's about, is getting people grounded in the moment, controlling the things they have control over, keeping things in perspective, right? Having routines and patterns and let them bleed off that emotion, because that's when they're gonna be more readily able to think clearly and understand kind of the proportions we're talking about. I will then go on and say, let's go with your argument that 26.8 million things, terrible bad things did happen to you last year. Didn't you survive every single one? right? And then again, you'll see the pause. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I did. And I will then counter with, if I was to tell you that I got in a fight with 26.8 million people last year, some of them really nasty and tough, I ultimately defeated every single one of them, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be sitting here right now talking to you guys. And now I'm going to tell you, oh, I got to get in a fight with someone next week and I'm freaking out about it. Wouldn't you be like, why? I mean, literally, you got in a fight with almost 27 million people. You got through it. You clearly know what you're doing, right? But if people don't step back and recognize that, what they're left with is their brain's going to do its default job, which is to find all the reasons why I'm going to be in danger and why I'm going to fail and why this isn't going to work. So having that concrete, constant reminder that literally everybody on this call, everyone you know personally and professionally, every student athlete you ever worked with, every single thing they've ever been through, they've gotten through. And the insidious irony of how things work neurologically, if we don't put some focused effort on, the more injurious and terrible and painful things people go through, the more their brains attune to threat, and the more their brain focuses on their own deficiencies because it wants them to strengthen those deficiencies. So these people who are actually superheroes in nature, who are forces of nature, who are so incredibly strong and resilient and can get through things that most people would waffle in the face of, and they got through them usually at ages when they were very undermatched with very little skills and very vulnerable, they have these insanely resilient capacities that they don't recognize because their brain's not organized at that point in a way to see it. All they see is the worst case. All they see is their own deficiencies and vulnerabilities. So our job, our role, frankly, irrespective of what capacity, is to help them recognize that. But to do that, we have to be able to recognize it in ourselves first, because you can't give to others what you yourselves don't have some level of mastery over. And we can't arrive at these recognitions ourselves if we ourselves are not taking care of our day-to-day routines and bleeding off the stress and doing all the things that we're talking about today to put ourselves in a position of strength. Because no matter what you try to do for your athletes and your colleagues and your families, if you are not taking care of yourself first and foremost, then it's not going to work ultimately, because you're not going to have the reserves to do it.
Great. This is a great time if anyone does have questions to enter them in the chat, or you can, that's probably the way to go. I don't mind if people unmute and ask as well.
Yeah, Jerry, this is Julie. I guess I have one. You know, Kevin, talking about the attitude of appreciation, you know, just out of curiosity, as being a former student athlete, like how, right, it's a work in progress, and how long has it taken you to get to that point, right? As we're talking through these things, because I think that's a huge point for student athletes. And, you know, how do we get them over that hump? Because your constant need as a student athlete, or want as a student athlete, is that feeling of perfection almost, right? And the appreciation, you know, the sportsmanship for your teammates, for, you know, whoever you're competing against, and like what does that look like for you, like as you progress in your career?
So I can tell you literally the exact moment I started to have the perception of compare previous events to current events on a misery scale, to make it more manageable. So Good Friday, I don't know what you were all doing, but Good Friday in 1992, I was up in the field house at the University of Maine at 6 in the morning with 109 of my teammates, having to do what arguably was the worst physical thing I've ever done in my life, right? So a position like the running backs went out onto the track, eighth of a mile track, and they had to sprint as fast as they could while the rest of us were in the middle doing squat thrusts. When they finished, we offensive linemen went out. We had to sprint as fast as we could while everyone's doing push-ups. And that went round and round and round until we filled 8 different of those big 50-gallon drum garbage cans a quarter of the way up with vomit. Because the night before, our field goal kicker had walked into the study hall wearing his hat. And that was a huge, you're not supposed to wear a hat inside. So the punishment for that was us all being that, you know, Good Friday morning, 1992, running around that field house until we accomplished that goal. Awful, horrible, took about 3.5 hours, right? Worst 3.5 hours of my life. Coming out of that, I started to recognize, I started to measure challenges that I was facing relative to that, because what it turned into, at least I'm not doing that, right? At least it's not that bad, right? And then that blossomed into, when I started working professionally, seeing the things I do with the people I work with, you know, when I then cross-reference that to my own life, it's like, well, God, at least it's not that bad. Our athletes already have this built in by virtue of their training and their preparatory work, right? Is You know, all right, yeah, having to do stuff online is bad, but how's it feel to freaking, you know, compared to running sprints for a half hour nonstop? How's it compare to getting your ass kicked on the field, right, and losing the game? How's that work, right? And again, I think it's a natural tendency that evolves on its own pace as we maturate, but we don't have to wait, right? This is, I referenced earlier, the opportunity inherent with situations like this is we can help people accelerate their skills and by extension, change the trajectory of, in some cases, the next several decades of their life. So simply point it out to them, right? Making them aware that this is a concrete strategy that you can start to employ to make this a little bit more tolerable, to help yourself starting to find value, and to use this as a tool for the rest of your life, right? And I think it has huge and profound value, and it's a very simple concept. It's just aligning people's attention to it, and then having it be something that gets enculturated, right? Where they're holding themselves accountable to it, whereas teammates, the captains, and the teammates themselves are like, hey, you know, the mantra now becomes, yeah, this sucks, but compared to whatever event they collectively decide to use, they're able to use that as a referential point. Because if I'm being completely honest, it wasn't, you know, knucklehead 19, 20-year-old Kevin Murphy who's like, oh yeah, compared to that Good Friday, this is a bad. That became the team mantra, right? Because shortly thereafter, we got into spring ball, and we're sitting there beating the snot out of each other in spring ball, and you're limping back into the field house, and you're exhausted, you have to go to class. But the team mantra was, at least it wasn't Good Friday bad, right? And that became kind of tethering point for us as a team to deal with future adversity. I don't know if anyone else in the team took it and internalized as individual pursuit, but I certainly did, and then started adding that metric as I moved forward.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yep.
We did have a couple of questions come in. Shelly is a fall coach and struggling with cultivating the first years into the team. I think incorporating them into the team because we didn't get to have practices the same way and do some of those things. And if we did, it might have been in pods. Anything you'd counsel for that team building dynamic with the current situation?
So again, with an eye towards simplicity, right? Let's go back to the basic structure that we're a pack animal and misery loves company, right? Every scrap of social psychology research has been ever done on building a cohesion or connection within groups of human beings, teams or otherwise, focuses on if you can rally around a common point that has resonance for the group, that becomes a catalyst for growth and connectivity. So I referenced earlier that we're all going through this COVID crisis. Yes, there's subjective variations on how each individually is doing it, but it is something that's impacting all of us in similar ways. So for the first years, yes, we can't do the same, you know, face-to-face incorporation of them into the team and the relationship building and all those different activities. But if we have, say, structured Zoom calls, right, if that's the world we're living in, where weekly we're checking in, right, that we're having conversations about the shared misery, not just to, you know, commiserate about it, but to actually what to do about it, that now becomes, ironically, the very thing that is separating us can in fact become a bonding element in that we can do work collectively and talk collectively about what our experiences are, right? And then start to create that culture where not only are they doing it formally, that the expectation is they're connecting with each other and put the emphasis to the upperclassmen, right? It's like, come on, think back to when you were first year, how challenging that was, and now add all this to it. So are you guys as upperclassmen reaching out to your first year teammates? Are you making them feel included? Are you giving them strategies and tips? Because ultimately nothing conveys mastery of a topic like having to teach other people. So charging the upperclassmen with, you know, sharing some strategies and tips and what's working for them. Not reinvent the wheel. So having, you know, again, those regular scheduled dialogues via Zoom where the weekly task is, okay, what did you guys experience this week and what worked, right? Let's not just focus on the negatives, what's working and how do we now start creating a concrete blueprint and use that as not only, you know, a way to navigate through the challenges we're all experiencing, but as a potential bonding element for the team as a whole, especially the first years.
Yeah. Maureen says that some student athletes have described losing their season like a death in the family. We need to help them find perspective, but for some it is the worst thing that's happened to them, so they don't have something for comparison. How would you help work through that?
So I had referenced in the onset of this conversation the importance of normalizing things, right? So in her response, she did just that, right? That, you know, there are students who this is the worst thing that's ever happened, right? So acknowledging that, helping them understand the dynamic of that our brain's going to want to find the worst case scenario anyway. So congratulations, kid, your brain's doing its job. Good job, okay? But now let's talk about if this is the worst thing ever, then it's going to have some significant compromising implications on your ability to function and think through it. So let's, again, talk about use the team, use the coaches, use the system as a source of strength. support to figure out and help them how to move through it. And this is where we tie back in, okay, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. This is actually a good thing because now you have everything else from here is going to be downhill, right? This is a gentle glide path. I very much believe that, you know, individually and as groups and couples have to as well, everybody has to go through awful things at some point in life. That's just the nature of living and the experiences that we have as human beings. So isn't it better to go through some of these awful things earlier in life so you develop skills and create capacities? One of the things I've been saying to all the students, you know, when I'm doing sessions with people and I hear similar things, it's like, look, you came to college to get good at stuff you're not already good at, right? And you're being compelled, understandably, to have to come to terms with and learn how to navigate and negotiate and deal with something of unprecedented proportions in your life and the society as a whole. So good on you, right? Because this, and again, the athletes are going to resonate. This is the equivalent of psychological, emotionally of going to the gym, right? So this is going to strengthen you. This is going to expand your capacities, and it's just helping them figure out how. So what exactly do we do? And again, that's where it goes back to the concrete planning, taking care of yourselves, physically, emotionally, cognitively, having elements within the team as far as support and consistency, erasing those question marks. But first and foremost, acknowledging the truth of that reality for them that, yes, I get it. It is the worst thing ever. It probably does feel like losing someone in your family because many of our student athletes, they are passionate, right? They have stronger relationships with their sports than they do their families of origin, because let's call it for what it is. Many people, if they're getting deeply wounded growing up, it's usually happening in their family of origins, and sports becomes their coping and their alternative and their sense of achievement identity, and all of that has been flushed over the past several months. Those are very real things. I think acknowledging, validating, and affirming, with all that being said, is do you want to sit there and wallow in it, or do you want to use it as a catalyst for growth? Because that's the choice you have. You can't control COVID. You can't control the fact that the season is gone, but you can control what you do with it and strengthen yourself moving forward if you choose to. And if you're the kind of athlete I thought you were when I recruited you, I know what choice you're going to make. If you need help with that, that's what we're here to do.
That's great. I appreciate that. Our last comment came from Jay Butler. He's envious of your Santa beard and look and loves the persona. And
You should
thanks
see my wife's beard if you like mine. She's Sicilian. I'm kidding. Horrible.
Yeah, well, I think I echo what Jay said. Thank you for a wonderful session. Appreciate everything you shared. You packed a lot into 57 minutes, and I know I'm grateful for that. I'm sure the rest of the call is as well.
Happy to be of service. And again, I referenced, you know, we had an hour to talk about topics that literally we could and should spend months on. So I'm certainly available as a resource to the group as a whole. So if folks have any interest in, you know, connecting up offline and doing something, Jerry has my contact info. You can just go from there.
Absolutely. And I can tell you that of all the speakers we've had on campus in my 3 years here, the assessments from the student athletes for Kevin's sessions were far and away the best that we've ever had. I appreciate it. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks, Julie, for your help. I hope everyone has a good Friday and a great weekend.
Take care, everybody.